Hi gang, so the ASTRA Militarum, or the Imperial Guard of Warhammer 40k, are one of the most flexible and diverse factions in the game, drawn from the million worlds of the Imperium, each with its own culture and dress and traditions, but as we know, much of what makes Warhammer what it is pulled from somewhere else, from history or other fiction, and so in this video I'm going to go through the most famous regiments of the Imperial Guard and have a look at their real-world influences. So last time I did a video like this, I looked into all the references and influences behind the Primarchs, those immortal demigods that led the Space Marine legions. And because we were looking at names, their references were often very specific, named after a character or an author or a mythological figure. The regiments of the ASTRA Militarum have just as many historical reference points. Games Workshop have released loads of different regiments over the years, and the idea that these regiments all come from different worlds has allowed the sculptors and designers to base lots of them on real-world military formations. But since we're talking about whole planetary cultures rather than named characters, things are a bit more of a blend. Many of the Imperial Guard regiments released as model ranges by Games Workshop have obvious historical reference points, but they're also often a blend of one or two things, or based more on cinematic and fictional representations rather than the real-world soldiers from actual history. There are, of course, way too many regiments just mentioned in the background to cover, so in this video I'm going to cover every regiment that got models, and there are essentially three waves of ASTRA Militarum models. When Rogue Trader, the first edition of 40k, was released in the late 80s, there was a plastic and metal range of Imperial Army, who were later renamed to Imperial Guard. Then in the 90s, second edition 40k introduced the idea of having different uniforms for every regiment, and released various metal ranges based around the soldiers from specific planets. These are all the now famous ones. Originally Cadian, Catachan, Talon, Mordian and Valhallan, with a few more added later. And then at the end of the 90s, a couple of those were consolidated into plastic ranges. Cadian was adopted as a sort of standard default guard uniform, and then other regiments were confined to special releases like Forge World ranges or one-off box sets. Still, we will get through them. Let's start with the most obvious ones, but also kind of the least historical ones. Cadian Shock Troopers. In 40k, the Cadian Shock Troopers are the elite of Imperial Guard regiments, from the planet of Cadia near the Eye of Terror, but their uniform style and armour is also considered something of a standard for many other regiments. So their models are the closest thing to generic ASTRA Militarum the Imperium has. When they were first released in 2nd edition as a metal range, this wasn't the case. It became a thing once Cadians were picked to become the Imperial Guard plastics. And that sort of generic nature is reflected in their influences, which are probably the most general and wide-ranging of all those original regiments. The first influence on Cadians is, well, Imperial Guard kits. In Rogue Trader, the first edition of the game, the Imperial Guard looked like this. In those days, the Imperial Guard really did have a standard uniform, and the big round helmets and angular body armour reminds me of generic sci-fi soldiers from across the 70s and 80s, but particularly 2000 AD, the British countercultural sci-fi comic, with references like the body armour of Strontium Dog mixed with the helmet from Rogue Trooper. That shouldn't be surprising. At the time these were being released, Games Workshop was making 2000 AD tie-in games and model ranges. The poster regiment for the Imperial Guard in the late 80s were the Necromundan Spiders. Necromunda was one of those planets that popped up everywhere in early 40k, well before the game of Underhive warfare. But the Spiders weren't the only regiment out there. One of the other ones that was detailed and released as pictures in White Dwarf were these, the 5th Arcadian Regiment. That's a reference to ancient Greece, but which might also be a clue to the naming of these guys. Of course, Cadians have a generic sci-fi trooper look and feel even now. One of the most obvious touch points is the Colonial Marines from the 1986 movie Aliens. The helmet and rigid armour is pretty similar. People also erroneously often cite Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers movie as an influence, but of course that movie didn't come out until 1996. 4 years after these. Also, I've just lit the candle. The start of this video is probably cursed now. Historically, there's less to go on with the Cadians. They kind of look like any post-war military in the latter half of the 20th century. Canadians in the two world wars were known for being called shock troops, so that's another possible reference, but these guys aren't really in any other way particularly Canadian. No, Cadians are essentially what if modern military but also sci-fi, with a healthy dose of Rogue Trader and Aliens as the influences. But next up are a much more obvious reference. Catachan Jungle Fighters. Katachan. It's a big galaxy, and Katachan never sounded like a believable place name to me. I'm sure they pronounce it multiple ways in the giant galaxy of the 41st millennium. Anyway, whatever you call them, these guys hail from a deadly jungle planet full of apex predators and carnivorous vegetation, making them particularly strong and hardy warriors. In some books, they're depicted as stocky, and in others, they look half Ogryn, so exactly how big is up for debate. The obvious intended reference here is the Vietnam War. The jungle setting, hot weather uniforms and bandanas bring it to mind, and there's this sense of like trap-playing guerrilla warfare in the background. But the Katachans don't reference the real-world Vietnam War as much as they reference the media made after it. The real influence on the jungle fighters is American action movies of the late 80s. It's First Blood, Commando, Predator. Those Stallone and Schwarzenegger movies are where the bulging biceps come from. They're sort of a rehabilitated cartoon Vietnam of the 80s, complete with extra flamers for burning back vegetation and references to evil alien predators lurking in the jungle. They even have a special character named Sly Marbo, Sylvester Stallone's Rambo as an anagram. His first name was shortened to Sly. And this limited edition colonel is Carl Weathers in Predator, even if Ripper Jackson gives us more Vasquez from Alien vibes. In the books, they're also sometimes Australian, because, I don't know, deadly animals, I guess. Okay, let's do an obvious one. The Valhallan Ice Warriors from the ice planet of Valhalla. Well, Valhalla is of course a mythical afterlife in Norse mythology, but don't let that fool you. These guys are in every possible way Soviet World War II Red Army. Winter dress, the trench coats and caps are obvious. In fact, they're kind of exaggerated stereotypes of the Red Army, known for mercilessly throwing thousands of bodies at any problem. Their old special character, Kubrik Chenkov, so just Russian names British people know there, was known for assaulting fortresses without any artillery support, just wave upon wave of Valhallans and shooting anyone who ran. There's very little sci-fi here. They're the wartime Soviet army as seen in like 1960s British comic books. This has been tracked back a bit in the recent Commissar Kane novels where the main characters are all Valhallan. But one Russian stereotype that has survived is the love of tea. The Valhallans drink Tanner tea and brew it in samovars inside their tanks. Okay, another obvious one. The Attilan Rough Riders are drawn from the feudal world of Attila, populated by tribes of roving horse nomads who contribute skilled cavalry units to the ASTRA Militarum. Attila is a reference to Attila the Hun, king of the Huns, a civilization of horse nomads from Central Asia who fought against the last vestiges of the Roman Empire in the 400s. But although they're called that, they kind of fold in references from every other Eurasian steppe people. From the Scythians, a word just used to refer to various steppe people from the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE, to the Mongols. They visually look a lot more like descriptions of the Mongols, but that might be because the Mongols of, say, Genghis Khan were active in the Middle Ages, so we have a lot more visual evidence of them. But yeah, Central Asian steppe horse people all mixed into one. Okay, continuing our journey through the 90s metal ranges and across the world, Games Workshop apparently following the lead of Disney in the 90s, we have the Talon Desert Raiders, and they're another unit that have changed over time. Talon is a desert planet, and its regiments are famous for guerrilla hit-and-run warfare. There are a few mixed influences in here. Their background and style originally evoked a World War II desert tank warfare feel, especially the goggles, and of course the fact that Talon was the site of a massive tank battle during the Horus Heresy. But the real influences here go back to World War I, or particularly, yet again, a movie about World War I. The biggest influence on the Talons are the Bedouins of around the turn of the century up to the First World War. The style of costumes and headdresses are similar, but really they're the Bedouins as imagined by the film version of Lawrence of Arabia. The fact that all the original Talons are painted as clean-shaven white guys maybe sort of gives that away. And that Middle Eastern theme has been played up in some of the more recent novels, sometimes pretty awkwardly. One of the older Kane novels has the Talons being exceptionally religious, even for the Imperium, which is, yeah. Anyway, another mixed bag. They're as much Middle Eastern as they are Western soldiers in the Middle East, all mushed together. Next up, we have the Mordian Iron Guard, and these are a real blend. The Mordians come from a dark and oppressive hive world whose environment breeds rebellion and have to visibly keep the peace, favouring bright uniforms and fighting in close order. American viewers might look at these and go, US Marine dress uniform, and there's definitely some of that in there, but there are more similar uniforms in history. One of the most commonly mentioned references is soldiers in the Franco-Prussian War War of 1870, and some of the uniforms from that time certainly fit the bill in terms of leg piping and fancy epaulettes. That's also probably more accurate because of the period. Brightly coloured troops fighting in close order is a very 19th century thing, and I think that general concept has been blended with other bright dress uniform themes to create the Mordians. That theme also pops up again in the Mordians variant range, the Praetorian 24th. Pretoria in 30k is another heavily industrialised hive world full of teeming factories. There's loads of those. It's sort of space Victorian Britain, and the models are just the Mordian range with a head swap to these pith helmets. The reference to this being British colonial troops during the Zulu and maybe Boer Wars in southern Africa in the late 19th century. The Praetorians were a limited edition range created for Games Day 1997 for a display called Battle of Big Tooth River, later renamed the Massacre at Big Tooth River, where the Praetorians were annihilated by Orc forces after underestimating them, which is a direct reference to the Battle of Isandlwana, the first engagement in the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, where the main British column was destroyed by the Zulus after underestimating them. It even featured a last stand called Orc's Drift, which is a reference to the defence of Rorke's Drift, a famous last stand by wounded British and colonial soldiers against a much larger force of Zulu warriors that happened directly after the previous battle, and was made famous by the film Zulu, which, let's be honest, is actually the reference for this entire range. Okay, moving on to one of the more dodgy ones. The Armageddon Steel Legion are mechanised infantry, deployed into the toxic ash wastes of their homeworld to hunt down the Orc warbands that infest them before they become too big a threat, fighting from huge columns of chimera armoured vehicles. The range featured heavily in the 2000 Armageddon campaign during 3rd edition. The models here are still metal, but they have a newer style of heavy weapons compared to the 90s regiments. Again, there's a load of influences here. The best summary is probably interwar sort of German. The helmet looks a lot like a World War II German paratrooper helmet. The goggles evoke World War II desert dust goggles, but the respirator and mask looks like a World War I British box respirator. The mid-length coat has similarities to both late World War I British uniforms and German paratrooper smocks, but their tactics feel like they're a take on German Panzer Grenadiers. And as you can guess, an army of the Imperium that reference World War II Germany and are a little bit blitzkriegi can attract some of the worst humans in the community. Also, as a friend pointed out, their logo is a lightning strike on a cog, which makes total sense from a lore point of view, but on the model it's depicted as a lightning strike on a circle, which makes it really similar to this symbol, which is completely unsurprising. Okay, next up is our last metal range, the Vostroyan Firstborn, released in the early 2000s. Vostroya in 40k is an ancient and cold, industrialised hive world whose citizens take their duties to the Imperium very seriously, sending their firstborn children to serve in the planet's ASTRA Militarum regiments, carrying heirloom weapons handed down for generations. Right, when people see these, they tend to say Cossacks, mostly because of the hats and the Russian name, but as usual, there's a bit more in there. I'd describe these as Russian elite troops from the 17th and 18th centuries, possibly into the early 19th. Obvious influences are actually the Streltsy, the bodyguard of the Tsars, who were a social class with obligations to serve in the military, just like the Vostroyans, and then the later Russian Imperial Guard that replaced them, all of which had similar, at least to our eyes, uniforms that didn't change that much for a very long time. The long coats with braiding on the front could be any point in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but given that the Vostroyans have big fur busbies and moustaches rather than long beards, the influences are probably the latter end of that, nearer the Napoleonic Wars, and of course there's a load of other Napoleonic references in there too. The heads particularly look a lot like the French Imperial Guard. So yeah, definitely Russian, but with references a century or more earlier than our other Russian range. And also a lot more sci-fi. There's a steampunk vibe to the Vostroyans' heirloom technology that wasn't common in the other regiments and wouldn't pop up again in 40k until the Adeptus Mechanicus were fleshed out a decade later, which makes sense as Vostroya is meant to be in part controlled by the Mechanicus. Also, around the same time as the Vostroyans came out, the Horus Heresy was being fleshed out for the first time, with the Horus Heresy card game and later the Collected Visions books, and the long braided coats, moustaches and busbies was a whole thing in that setting too. From what I'm told, this all boils down to a few sketches from John Blanche, who thought that the 90s ranges all looked a bit too modern and wanted something stranger for the Imperial Guard. So after this point, the Cadians and Catachans had been released in plastic, so there were no new Guard models for a while. But in 2006, Forge World would release the Anphelion project, a campaign that featured a totally new regiment, the Elysian Drop Troops. The system of Elysia is full of asteroid fields and gas clouds, and the drop troops are kept busy hunting down the pirates within them via orbital insertion. There's no direct historical reference to any specific unit or country here. They kind of have a sci-fi paratrooper look to them. People have pointed out that their Acatran pattern bullpup lasguns look an awful lot like the French FAMAS, but there's not really any other specifically French references in them. So yeah, they're not that much of a historical one. Our next new regiment from Forge World, though, have a very obvious inspiration. The Death Corps of Krieg hail from the irradiated world of, Krieg. Ruined by a nuclear civil war centuries ago, the people of Krieg atone for their sin against the Imperium by manufacturing huge armies of expendable soldiers for the Imperial war machine, sometimes using prohibited technology to speed up the recruitment age, and producing wave after wave of fanatically dedicated corpsmen willing to die for the Emperor. They were created as another resin range from Forge World, but their origins are actually a few years earlier as an alternate colour scheme for the Steel Legion models. They were released as part of Forge World's Siege of Vrax campaign, a years-long campaign prosecuted through grinding trench warfare, and so, as you'd expect, the Death Corps can be summed up as World War I in space. Despite the name, Krieg is just German for war, so I wonder if their homeworld was called that before. Anyway, despite the name, their uniform actually has a lot more in common with the French army of World War I than the German army, especially given the colour scheme they were originally painted in. The uniforms are pretty obviously references to the French. But of course, it's a little more complex than that. The gas mask and respirator is the same British World War I reference as the Steel Legion, and their helmets are kind of a mix of a German style helm and a French Adrian helmet, leaning, I think, slightly more to the French. So yeah, World War I Western Front trench warfare uniforms in space. Okay, that's all the full regimental ranges produced by Games Workshop, but there are a few outliers. I mentioned the Napoleonic Wars earlier, and they have a few other references scattered throughout the Astra Militarum range. Ratlings in particular look a lot like Peninsular War era riflemen crossed with hobbits. But the real reference here is the Tanith First and Only from Dan Abnett's Gaunt's Ghost series, expert trackers and sharpshooters fighting their way through the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. While the world of Tanith itself is sort of Irish, Scottish, Welsh themed, their position within the wider Astra Militarum and their story that concentrates on the lives of the poor bloody infantry owes a lot to Bernard Cornwell's Sharp novels about a rifle regiment in the Peninsular War. At the time the Gaunt's Ghost stories were written, Sharp would have been a really well-known TV drama series in Britain. Other Napoleonic themes pop up with the design of commissars. Commissars in the Astra Militarum are basically a massive exaggeration of Soviet political commissars. Lots of different armies and police forces maintained a rank called commissar, or the related commissary, usually a term for a manager or a supply officer, and that makes sense in Warhammer 40k, where technically commissars work for the Departamento Munitorum, the institution that organise, recruit and supply the Imperial Guard. But in the Soviet armies of World War II and beyond, commissars were political officers responsible for morale, discipline, and propaganda, and for making sure the various unit commanders of the Soviet army, who all came from very different backgrounds, followed their orders. And while there are documented accounts of commissars shooting soldiers and officers who turned from the enemy, they're actually pretty rare. Obviously, 40k massively exaggerates this for grimdarkness. The rest is pretty accurate though. Just like in real life, 40k commissars are responsible for morale and discipline and can step in above officers if they feel like they're not following orders properly. In fact, both the Kane and Gaunt's Ghost books point out how most good commissars aren't particularly trigger happy. Kane considering field execution's a good way of getting yourself shot, and Gaunt considering it a sign that you're just doing your job badly. Anyway, I will link back here. The great big hat and big coat is directly out of the Cold War, but the rest of the uniform, the braided tunic, sash, high boots and sabre, is more like a dashing cavalry officer of the Napoleonic Wars. And finally, because I did say I'd do all the models, Schaefer's Last Chancers are a special character unit of penal legionnaires from various backgrounds who appeared in a trilogy of novels by Gav Thorpe and received a metal box of models in the late 90s. The individual members here are all from different units, many of which just recycle other 40k regiments, and some of which are pretty random. This is the guy from Jurassic Park. Warrior Woman wears an Amazonian leather skirt with a boob tube. And Shiv is, as far as I can tell, a sort of 50s Western depiction of a Native American. But the whole unit are actually a reference to the film The Dirty Dozen, about a unit of convicts undertaking a suicide mission in the Second World War. Okay, done. That's all the regiments actually represented as model ranges. There are a ton of others that only exist in the lore, and special characters who have their own set of influences, but this video has to end somewhere. We'll get round to them eventually. Watching these videos, it might seem that 40k is derivative as hell, and it is. That's one of the strengths of the setting. It very deliberately takes all these influences in, sometimes it blends them or changes them, sometimes it leaves them as is, so that you can play anything you want. It's a setting where you can play the Soviet Red Army against Tolkien's orcs but also football hooligans, where you can field a cavalry charge of 5th century Huns against 80s hair metal demons. And the regiments of the Astra Militarum are some of the best expressions of that. They're a blend of real-world history and cinematic stereotypes with a backstory that lets you play whatever you want from history as a valid army in 40k, however strange or out of place they seem. Maybe in future videos, we'll go through some of the other ones. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more 40k lore videos, have a look at the little box popping up there to the right, and if you'd like to support the channel, there are affiliate links to stores in the thing below, as well as a link to the Patreon. See ya!